these kids are taking it all in, and it's shocking. And our son was able to tell us, when he wasn't able to speak, he can tell us now and told us afterwards things that we said, things that were going on. We were dumbfounded that he actually absorbed all that. And it's not that our son is a genius. These kids, generally speaking, across the board, understand so much more than we give them credit for.
Let's ditch the quick fix and dive into today's conversation. Welcome, everybody. My guest today is Len Arcuri. Len is the host, one of the hosts, him and his wife. They host the Autism Parenting Secrets podcast, and they are the founders of Warrior Parenting Coaching. Their mission is to empower parents to transform into warrior parents who are better equipped to find answers that are right for their unique child. They believe the greatest gift a parent can give their child is their own transformation into a stronger, calmer, more capable, and more loving version of themselves. So much more is possible when the parent transforms first. They know how to overcome the challenges, roadblocks, and blind spots parents face as they support their child. Their podcast, Autism Parenting Secrets, interviews the best minds to help both parents and children thrive. Welcome, Len. It's really exciting to have you here today. It's such an important conversation on autism, and just want to be another voice to get a little bit of that information out that you guys have so much of.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So share with me a little bit more about yourself and maybe you and your wife's kind of background into, where you're at today with Warrior Parent Coaching and the podcast.
Sure.
How'd you get here?
Well, it's ironic because we're in the middle of shifting where we're actually rebranding what we call our coaching. So moving away from Warrior Parent Coaching more to all-in parent coaching. And
Nice.
The distinction is worth focusing on in terms of how we've changed, because I think when it goes to our story, warrior parent was a term that was big, over a dozen years ago, especially within the autism community, of a parent who was responding in a, let's say, more powerful way, and usually someone who was doing a whole bunch of stuff, right? Like that they were anything but passive, and it took on a meaning, and in some ways it could signal a parent who's wanting to do more for their child, and in other ways it could also signify a parent who's kind of at war with autism, like trying to defeat it. A lot of the conferences I went to early on were by a great organization, but they had a name which was Defeat Autism Now. And what my wife and I have learned is it's not about defeating autism. It's not about, being at war with that diagnosis, but there is a way of responding that can allow for more growth and progress, both in the parent and the child. And that's why we created the podcast, and that's why we have the coaching that we have.
That's awesome. I love the way that you're growing from your experience, right?
Yep, absolutely. Because these parents like us, most of anyone who's listening who may be touched by autism, parents want to respond in a powerful way, in a way that's useful, but there's so much about the autism journey that just feels so hard, and that it's more of you're enduring it, as opposed to, as a parent, really operating with self-confidence, trusting your intuition. And like a lot of things, like your podcast touches on so many concepts about the power of stepping off the standard path. Mm-hmm. And it couldn't be more true than within the autism journey, because there's a path of just doing nothing. And then there's also a path of kind of following the standard, like what do most people do? And what my wife and I learned was that it's so unique to the specific child that what's going to be useful for your child may be radically different than other children and other parents. And that's where it's just about getting curious and present to what's going on in your situation, and then having the self-confidence to step off and maybe do things that are not so popular, and where, you may be the only one, but they're a really good fit for your child. So we're trying to spread that message, that it's not about us as experts in autism, that a parent, that's not the missing link for a parent. What's a missing link is them getting to a greater place of clarity, and then trusting their gut as to what's going to be useful for their child.
That's great. And it's really kind of the message of this particular podcast, and I'm sure yours as well, is it's a journey. And if we're always looking for something, and there's going to be times where you need a quick Band-Aid and you need a quick, solution. But the journey is really, the emphasis that we try to share is that, how do we make good lifestyle decisions that give us the best chance to navigate even these very difficult ones, and autism is a very difficult one. What is autism? Let's just kind of go to the basic description of what is autism, and there's various elements of that, and spectrum, and
Sure.
those kind of things come up. So, what is autism?
Well, I'll qualify by saying I'm definitely not a doctor, not a therapist, not a practitioner of any kind, right? I'm just a parent, and I do provide coaching, and that term is such a charged term.
Mm-hmm.
And really within this area especially. So for me, before I even define it, I'll just start off by saying it truly doesn't matter, because all it is a label. And it took me a long time to understand that. And there may be people hearing that saying that this guy's ridiculous, but it truly is. It is a label. It's a label of symptoms that a child or an adult could be exhibiting. And if you have enough of them, you get this label of autism, and it could come in a lot of different flavors in terms of where on the spectrum, but it is simply a label. It does not define the person. It does not in any way define what's possible for the person, especially. And so I just find that an autism diagnosis can be useful for a parent to get information, but then after that, it has nothing to do with ultimately the goal for any parent, which, forget about whether you have a child with autism or a child with some challenge, any child. A parent's job is to figure out, well, what will be useful for my child as a parent? That's my responsibility, to be a great guide, to make great decisions on their behalf. And I've found, for my experience, and my wife and I share this, is that label, clinging to it and kind of focusing your energies there, does not help.
If you've listened to this podcast, you know how often ozone therapy comes up. I personally have the Simply O3 Complete Kit and use it as a preventative measure or when I come down with something. So whether it's ozone therapy at home or in your clinic, Simply O3 has equipment for your needs. If you are healing chronic illness or biohacking for optimal health, Simply O3 will make getting started with ozone therapy super easy. Go to simplyO3.com or call 844-655-2524. Use code FIX to get 10% off. That's www.simplyo as in oxygen 3.com.
So we help
Sure.
parents get comfortable with letting go of that term and not denying the reality of your child. Far from it. Get clear on what's going on. But that term itself can be, you can let go of the charge that has and just get curious to make better decisions for your child.
So I like that. I like that a lot. And I know you still can jump in on a little definition there, but I'm with you wholeheartedly. I try to share that with my patients. When you get a diagnosis, whatever it may be, you get so focused on the diagnosis, and then you do fall into the trap of there's only one stream to go down, right?
Yeah, and the definition, people can look it up clearly, and they can find out what the DSM says in terms of what it is. But one way that we help parents get clearer on it is there's a diagnostic tool called the ATEC, the Autism Treatment Evaluation Checklist. It's online, it's free, and you can get a sense of where your child is. And there's 4 categories. So I'm going to try to answer your question, like, what is autism? Mm-hmm. Well, if there's, let's just say, opportunities for improvement with respect to speech and communication, that's one category. Okay. Again, if you check enough boxes there,
sure,
that may indicate, okay, that's someone who might be on the autism spectrum. There's a lot of physical health issues, behavioral issues associated with autism, and it can run a wide variety. For us, our child, he had physical abdominal, like gut issues. He would posture, pushing his belly against furniture to get some relief. He had huge physical issues with respect to food allergies and the like. And so there's a lot of physical issues associated with autism. Those were a few for us. our son especially loved spinning himself, spinning any objects he could. He was obsessed with spinning in all ways that he could. So that's how it manifested with him. Other physical issues where he did bang his head. He had a lot going on, and so he found that was a useful thing for him, which was really hard as a parent to see. Yeah. So when I think of autism, you have these health and physical issues, you have these communication, speech type issues, you have in terms of just sensory, like and being more prone to being, let's just say, affected from a sensory perspective, how you're seeing things, light sensitivity, touch, smells, textures, and the like. So that's also a big part of it. But most people would characterize autism as sociability, like that people who have autism spectrum are in some way kind of in their own world. That's like the more classical definition of autism, somebody who might be isolated in their own world, perhaps rocking. And so that's where, again, it means different things to different people. And if you look at the criteria, there's so many aspects of, if you check a box here and there, then you might qualify as being on the spectrum in some way. But those were a few that were relevant for us.
Gotcha.
And it's usually characterized, when I say usually, quite often, there's a regression. So sometimes people are born and display immediately symptoms that would perhaps be aligned to the autism spectrum. And other times a child develops pretty typically, and then there's a regression, a loss of skills, and that was definitely the case for our son right after he turned 1. The language that he did have disappeared, and he definitely took many steps back. But he also had a host of physical issues where he became allergic to everything he ate, huge digestive issues. He was on a liquid medical food for about 2 years because he couldn't digest standard food. And so once we got the gut, helped his gut to get more in balance, then a lot. We saw incredible progress once we focused on the gut, which I'm sure that is, I know, a key area of focus for you as well.
It is definitely. I appreciate that background there, and I do appreciate the distinguishing factors that you have there. The causes, and like you said, sometimes there's a regression, a noticeable regression, and usually it's in the childhood ages when you see that big change. So what are some of the causes that have been found to be maybe part of that regression? Are they natural? Are they external? Or is there a combination of both? I know some of the things that I've found over the years, but what have you found in your study?
Well, as a parent, once you get that diagnosis, once I got it, that's all I was focused on. I had to find the cause. And I've, of course, changed my thinking where, of course, it's, at least in my mind, it's not a cause. There are multiple causes that have to be, it's more complex than we'd like it to be, right? Because I was trying to say, okay, what's the smoking gun? I'll address that, and my child will not have autism anymore. So as I've dove into this and really have become obsessed with figuring out how can a parent better navigate, I'm a big fan of the total load theory, which is simply that for each person, it could be different, but there's a variety of toxic insults, exposure, that there's a tipping point. And for some kids, their bucket gets filled up. And then after that tipping point, it can manifest in a number of ways. And for some children, it might be that they're on the autism spectrum, and it could also manifest in a number of different ways. So I feel like the cause, there's no question, there's some, I believe a small percent of perhaps children who have some genetic cause that results in them being on the spectrum, and that can absolutely be true. But at least my view, and from the experts who I work with and who I trust, the vast majority, it is not an autism gene or something that you can't do something about. For that huge majority, it comes down to, can you tip the scales more in taking actions that produce a less stressful environment, a less toxic environment. And toxins, when I first heard that term, I'm thinking chemicals, pollution, all that. Toxins take a whole variety of different forms. It can be chemicals and that type of thing. It can also be food and what's in our food and what's not in our food. It can be toxic people. It can be a lot of things, but it's that scale where if a parent can make really good decisions that help to minimize the harm, if they're doing something, if the child's exposed to stuff that's actually causing stress or causing friction, if a parent can take action to stop doing things that harm and can rechannel their energies on things that can produce an environment, then so much more becomes possible for the child to progress, whatever that means. And we're seeing miraculous things with parents that we coach. Once they take those types of actions that are 100% within their control, that space opens up, and we're seeing children make rapid progress in a direction that is just more in tune with how their bodies are designed. So it's not about, having to no longer have autism. It's about just helping a child thrive.
Sure.
So much a parent can do to help stack the deck in that direction.
Sure. I like that. There's definite evidence out there for the exposures for any disease. If you're around the EMFs, if you're around the volatile organic compounds, if you're around glyphosate, if you're around all these different things, your body's it's not good. You just don't want to put yourself in those environments that create the body's inability to thrive. It's a tough game, but there are those situations where, it is that tipping point for some where, ultimately it took them into a real significant change neurologically, physiologically, and all the above. So your focus, and this is what I think is really good, is, hey, how do we do the best with what we have? And, and in that we can try to help people understand that, hey, let's not, let our kids have a phone right up to their ear all day long, because there's some studies out there that say that's not the best exposure, all the EMFs and those kinds of things. So go ahead.
I was going to say, not just some studies, an incredible amount of scientific proof that kind of stuff, excessive amounts, it has to have a negative effect. So once you get educated,
I was being generous when I said some.
So I can appreciate that, but yeah, no, I'm in agreement for sure.
Yeah. So, and your son, you had indicated, about 1 year old, he had the transformation, and that you and your wife kind of went into, hey, how do we do this? And I think your wife has spent countless hours on the gut health, as far as nutrition goes. And is my understanding, I think, in preparation for this conversation, that your son was actually non-speaking for a while, and so some of those things were happening when he was younger. So you guys both went into, hey, how do we help our child? And it became, how do we help ourselves first to be able to help our child? So maybe go down that road a little bit.
Right. Well, ironically, it was the opposite, which is why we do the work we do now, because the last thing I was thinking after getting the diagnosis is, okay, I need to work on myself first in order to help my child, to be that best parent, because that's what every parent ultimately wants, to truly feel sincerely that they're being the best parent they can be for their child. This goes for any child, especially a child on the autism spectrum. And I wanted that, but initially all my focus was on, I got to fix my kid. This is not okay. And I'm not going to rest until I fix my kid. Now that sounded and felt great at the time. And I look back and I'm like, well, that was just so misguided. That energy I had was so misguided, because it was focused on, it seemed well-intentioned, but I was basically saying, my child's not okay right now. He has this thing called autism. I don't want autism. I don't want him judged. I don't want to be judged myself. So I did declare war on autism. And, right now I can see that was not in any way the best way I could show up. And so what my wife and I have learned, and what we try to do, and what we were doing with our coaching, especially, and our podcast, is trying to show parents the opportunity before they start diving into these therapies and these doctors and these supplements or whatever the case may be. Know that where they are now, when they get that diagnosis, there's ways that they're operating that are going to hold them back. And that might be okay, but once you become a parent, everything changes because you're no longer just focused on yourself.
Right.
You have someone else who's relying on you. That's why a parent, if they can transform first to go from where they are, which could be a fantastic, loving parent, but we just have learned, we knew we weren't equipped to navigate well. And doing that work on ourselves, which ultimately is all within your control, it's inconvenient, it takes effort, but it doesn't have to take a long time, can help a parent get into a radically stronger position to ultimately do what they really want, which is to make good decisions about what's right for their child, which for so many people, including us, doing what the quote unquote experts recommended was the exact opposite of what our son really needed. So that's why we're just so wanting parents to see that opportunity. If they can focus on their own transformation first, everything becomes better. They'll make better decisions. They'll spend less money on things that don't work. And as you said, it's all about the journey. As much as we all want the outcome of our child not having autism and graduating and leading an independent life, the journey is what this is all about. And so how do you radically change how you're operating so that this journey, even if your child is experiencing things that you're not wanting, it can be a peaceful, calm, and loving journey. And I know early on, I was not crafting that journey. Mine was one of non-acceptance and a lot of pressure and a lot of heaviness. And I wasn't going to be okay until this thing was gone. If I would have stayed there, our son absolutely would not have made the progress that he did.
Yeah. And yeah, so it's the difference between, emphasizing the day-to-day, everyday life with your family and your child to the outcome. It's like if my child doesn't get to be an MIT grad and go on to do this, then the life hasn't been worth it. And that's such a sad perspective, right? And so, so each day has to be that value day. We just don't know how many we get. So, each day you kind of have to take one at a time. So what has been, some of the tools that you've used, just kind of in a general sense? I know nutrition is one, gut health. What are some of the tools that you have used? And I don't know, how old is your son now?
He is going to be 16 in December. So he's
okay. So you've had a bit of a journey from the start of this to now, for sure. What are some of the things that you've noticed? You said that, I think you were saying there's some things that you've noticed that really were very profound when you started getting the nutrition and things of that nature going.
Yeah, everything holistic and everything, that was more energy based was huge for my son. And conventional medicine did not work for him, especially with a lot of his gut issues. It got to a point where like medicine that he was taking would go in one end and come out exactly the same on the other end. His body couldn't process it. So we kind of didn't have a choice other than to open up, the toolbox to say, hey, what else might really help him? And because of his food allergies, life-threatening food allergies, we had no choice but to take diet much more seriously. Without those true allergies, not just intolerances, I'm sure I would have taken the lazier route and said, food's not that big of a deal. So I think in order, and a little
bit of a blessing in disguise there, it sounds like.
Totally. It changed not only for him, but changed radically. My wife and I are totally unrecognizable compared to how we started. But I think high level, the answer to your question, the biggest things that move the needle most for our son, food for sure, reducing stressors in the environment of all kinds. EMFs are a gigantic issue as well, but it's really hard to top the importance of getting food right. And that doesn't mean just going gluten-free. That means for your child, what foods cause inflammation, chronic inflammation, and they're going to just, for your child, be something to avoid, and what are the superfoods that to introduce more of to help thriving. So food couldn't be more important. Reducing other toxins in the environment, including EMFs. For us, homeopathy was life-saving for my son, because he ultimately was failure to thrive, and one remedy changed everything for us, and it happened to be the right remedy for him. Nobody was more skeptical about homeopathy than I was, and I have seen way too much significant conclusive evidence that for us that was a really phenomenal fit. And chiropractic care also huge. We did cranial sacral early on, had a phenomenal provider when we were living in New York City at the time. And then now periodic chiropractic care from the right chiropractor is a huge way that we just help ensure our son's body, our daughters, our bodies are functioning as they're intended. And that's where I think everything that really helped us was the unifying element.
Gotcha.
How can we help the body do what it's designed to do? We don't need to introduce new things. What can we do to just allow the miraculous healing power of the body to take effect? And when we've done that with these types of measures that we committed to, we saw how much our son, especially his body, could get into a much better place.
So, just kind of on a personal testimony, and I might ask you to maybe share on maybe if other testimonies that you've had with helping parents, but just on your own personal testimony, what are some of the things that your son's, let's say positive steps of progression, with the different things that you did, what he, was able to do after you implemented what are some of the positives, like going from non-speaking to speaking? Most people don't realize when they just consider the behavior patterns that kids have, not exclusive to autistic children, by the way, but many times a non-speaking child is a very intelligent child, and they're frustrated because they're not able to connect that autonomic thought to the motor reality of getting the voice box to work. So that's got to be so challenging for a child that's basically not able to express, but has all the mind opportunities there. So what are some of the progressions that you saw with your child as you went through things?
What you just said is absolutely true. And I didn't want to believe it either, but like, these kids understand everything. They don't show it, and maybe have an inability to show it. And we talked before we recorded, we were talking about J.B. Handley as an example.
Right.
He has a phenomenal book called Underestimated, and he was on our podcast as well. And that's episode 38, an unbelievable episode, but it touches on this, that these kids are taking it all in, and it's shocking. And our son was able to tell us, when he wasn't able to speak, he can tell us now, and told us afterwards things that we said, things that were going on. We were dumbfounded that he actually absorbed all that. And it's not that our son is a genius. These kids, generally speaking, across the board, understand so much more than we give them credit for. So with our son, the lack of speech, just like with the people that we coach, is the hardest thing, because parents want nothing more than to have that communication.
Right.
And if it's delayed, if it's beyond what's expected, it's excruciating. And so that's a big one. And yeah, there could be a lot of issues that are behind a child's inability to speak. And that's where for us, our son, he was just not getting the building blocks for his body to thrive. I mean, it was in survival mode. So that's where food, some supplements, and just a more nourishing environment, he was delayed, but he caught up. And I remember being in a conference and hearing some parent talking about their child's quote unquote recovery, which was very motivating to hear that term and know that that's possible. But the parent was saying how their child couldn't speak for a long, long time. And now that their child talks too much, like that and I was like, I heard that and I was so offended.
Yeah.
Hearing that, I'm like, my greatest dream, and you're joking that you have too much of it now. And I was really angry and sitting in the third row, just not being inspired by this person and kind of hating them. But it's totally true for me now, where my son, he's nonstop. And I have to kind of remind myself what a gift it is that he is speaking.
Yeah.
And so that's where, as a parent, I know I'm never happy. There's always stuff I want to change. So learning acceptance true acceptance of my child, that was a game-changing thing. But in answer to your question, homeopathy, we saw literal physical improvements. His body started to be able to digest food. His body started to be able to, like, he started to have earwax because his body wasn't even making something like earwax because it just didn't have the energy. So that's where everything that we did, we saw different signs of how it was manifesting. That ATEC that I mentioned, that's the score, the Autism Treatment Evaluation Checklist. What we like about it is that you assess your child across, I think it's 80 data points, and it's something that's free. A parent can do in 10, 15 minutes. And it's something which, because parents, we can't notice what's changing for our child. So to have an assessment like that will help you. If you do it periodically, you can see what's shifting. Because as a parent, just like we can't notice when our kids grow, in height, and everyone's like, wow, look how tall. We don't notice it because we're right there. It's the same thing with symptoms. So that's where, by doing that ATEC kind of frequently, early on, especially when things were really at their most extreme with our child, we were able to start seeing, oh, this is shifting. Oh, they're a little bit more engaged, a little bit more, in terms of verbal communication, and so that's where, when I think of the big things that we did, we saw physical issues. We saw, and one thing I think I forgot to mention also that we did, which was a definite road less traveled, is from a therapy perspective. We started off with behavioral type therapy, which is the standard, gold standard. And then after a certain period of time, we stepped off of that and moved more to a child-centered approach. And there's an organization, the Option Institute, and they created something called the Sunrise Program, which is all about going with your child instead of trying to change them. So when you talk about things that we did and what did we see, I'll just give you a quick example. When we stopped sitting ourselves in front of our son in front of a person, a therapist or ourselves, with the intent on trying to change him, to have him not do the behaviors that we didn't like, to have him do more of the behaviors that we wanted. When we stopped doing that and just went with him, let him lead, well, the eye contact that we got from him was through the roof, because he was excited to be with us, because we weren't trying to force him to do something that he wasn't ready for or not wanting to do. So by taking a totally different approach to how we were with him, changed everything in terms of him, even, initially seeing what the opportunity was for him to be engaged in our world. Like, so we had to create an inviting environment, and nobody likes to be pressured and told what to do. So when we changed and used that program, that was a dynamite fit for what we most needed. And that forever changed, because once we started a stronger bond and connection with him, once he sincerely wanted to be with us, so much more became possible for the other things that we could then teach him.
That's awesome. And it goes back to what you're saying. You're trying to switch away from the diagnosis to the, how do you become a better parent? Because what you're talking about is that's a strategy that's good for any child.
No doubt.
Right. So that's that all-in parenting that you're switching into. I like that a lot. You also, kind of touched just a little bit in the conversation about, basically the design, just allowing the body to heal. And it sounds like a lot of your focus with homeopathy, and I don't know if it was, but I imagine a lot of it was that gut health kind of focus with homeopathic and nutritional things. And there's just all kinds of studies too about the connection between the gut and brain health. So that design thing, though, there was, I think, some spiritual elements that you guys added into your world too. It sounded like when I was doing some prep. What was the spiritual elements that were helpful for you?
Well, with us, first and foremost, most time we can spend in nature, the better, and that is spiritual. I mean, if you're just sitting there at home, surrounded by technology, breathing, indoor air, there's just something that happens when you get out in nature. So we were living in New York City at the time, and we would go for walks around Lower Manhattan, and wherever my son saw a tree, even if it was like one tree surrounded by cement, he would just run to it. And so spiritually getting into nature, taking the time, going especially to the beach, all that was super important. And even now where we live, it's like, no matter what's happening, there's at least 5 minutes, feet in the grass, outside connecting to nature.
Connected to your...
Yeah, so that's first and foremost. But otherwise, for us, religion also became really important. Initially, we weren't very religious. I took my son and my daughter while my wife was out of town. I said, okay, let me just see what church might be like. And this was at the height of my son not being able to sit still for anything, for using loud sounds and echolalia and screaming, and just, he was totally unpredictable and I was totally exhausted. But I was curious. I'm like, well, what would they be like in church? Like, would that be a good or bad thing? So I went to we had just started renting a house because we moved out of the city, and I went to the local church and I was like, let me just, maybe I'll stand in the back with my kids and just see how it goes, type of thing. And so we showed up, and it was just serendipity. We showed up and immediately locked eyes with the person at the front, and he saw us coming in, and there was literally no seat, no standing anywhere except right in the front row. So I had no choice but to keep walking, and we were in the front row and sat there for 55 minutes or so. And my son was mesmerized by the whole thing. This was a Roman Catholic church.
Okay.
He was just taking it all in, and he loved it. I've never seen him more calm than sitting in there. And it wasn't like I was sitting there threatening him, hoping that I just let him be who he was going to. And both my son and my daughter they really loved it. And they just silently, you could tell it was a fit. So, that showed us that from a spiritual perspective, my son's always especially been connected in a way that that I don't fully understand. So spirituality has always been important. And for that period of time, religion became important for us. But right now, it's just getting out in nature and just kind of surrendering and being less kind of concerned with what other people think and trying to compete. For us, part of spirituality is just being present to the moment. And if we want our kids to feel that way and to exhibit that, my wife and I need to model it ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. So, gosh, so much, we could go down so many roads with this topic. What are some of the primary goals that you have now with all-in parenting? What are your basic goals if you're to speak to the mom and dad right now that are in the role that you were in 15 years ago? What are the goals now?
Well, with the podcast and with our coaching, the main goal is to equip the parent, and how do you get equipped? It comes down to things that will be very familiar to you, right? Because this is not like anything that's unknown, but the way we kind of package it is kind of unique. But getting equipped means the mindset has to be serving you. It's got to be a growth mindset, focusing on what's possible. And because if you have a fixed mindset as an autism parent saying, hey, it's autism, it's brain injury, there's nothing we can do about it, you're cutting off immediately any possibility of growth for your child, growth for yourself. So mindset is the key, getting it aligned towards where you want to go. The other thing is a goal that we have with parents is, well, you need to have the vision. You need to know where you're going. That may sound obvious, but it is not. The clearer the vision is of what you're wanting, that frees up so much of your energy, redirects your energy. So mindset, where you're going, the visioning, and where at least I personally spend a lot of time with clients is all about what we call the roots, which is below the surface. It's about the beliefs that you're holding. What are the stories that you're telling yourself? Because shifts there make the biggest difference in terms of how a parent is feeling, the energy they're exuding. And we all tell ourselves lousy stories that may have made sense at one point when we learned them, perhaps as a child. But right now, all they can do is produce misery. So for a parent to become aware of those stories, which by definition, we're not aware of them, they just are kind of unconscious. But when we work with parents and help them to bring awareness to what the story is that they're telling themselves, gives them the space to be able to, if they want, to tell themselves a better story. When those changes take place, that's when the journey transforms.
Awesome. So speak to that just in a little bit. I'll just maybe frame it in a little bit of a different way, what you're kind of hitting on there. What are the myths or the stories? What are the myths that are out there? Some of the myths that are out there that, basically kind of like, hey, it seemed true, but it's not really true.
Oh, there's a lot.
Just a couple.
Yeah, no, there's a lot, but all roads ultimately lead to two big ones, which is one, my child's broken and needs to be fixed, as I alluded to earlier.
Yep.
And that's probably the most powerful one. But if there is one that trumps it in terms of what's going on inside of a parent's head, the most disabling story is that I'm broken, that I'm not enough as a parent. So those two huge beliefs, there's a lot of different flavors of it, but those two in of themselves cause the bulk of what feels hard with autism. Because especially the child, as I alluded to earlier, if you think they're broken and you're looking at them as and are projecting brokenness on them, they feel that. So no matter what you say, no matter what your intent is, it's the equivalent of kind of, because we all want as parents to have our kids be connected to us. But if you're judging your child as broken, that they're not enough until they have X, Y, and Z fixed or don't have, then what you're basically doing is you're kind of waving toward like, hey, come become connected with me, while with the other hand holding out saying stop. So you're sending mixed signals to your child. You want to be connected with them, but yet you're judging them as not enough. You're rejecting them. So that's where these beliefs about, and not just something you make up, but like a sincere belief that your child is right now doing the best they can based on where they are. They are what they are. You can accept the fact that this is what's happening right now. It doesn't mean that you don't want to change it. But if you look at your child with this, I like this part of them, but this part has to change. Because I used to always say to people, I love my son completely. I just hate the autism, which made absolutely no sense. So the more a parent can just be like, my child isn't broken right now, even with this label that someone gave, even with these behaviors I don't want. They're doing everything for a reason. And I can look at my child as they're doing what they're doing. And from that standpoint of acceptance, now let me take some actions that can help improve things. So it's a subtle shift, but a really big one in terms of the magnitude.
Yeah, and and taking off a little bit of what JB Hanley shares and his experience with Elizabeth Vossler, and it seemed like it was a big growth point for him. And it was I read both books. I told you that before we started recording.
Yeah.
In both books, I was in tears. I was in a lot of tears when I read the second book. Just what they went through as parents. But one of the keys that I saw in those books, and I'm sure that this has been your experience too, and it's probably exactly how you teach parents, it's to communicate with a child as though they know every single word you're saying and understand the context and appreciation of it. Because I think that's been one of the biggest negatives that parents and culture and the standard approach has taken, that they just, even if a child really doesn't have the cognition to comprehend or understand language, why are we not speaking to everybody on the planet as though they do? Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And it's so true. Again, not just for a child on the spectrum. We had an ABA therapist who early on, as I mentioned, we moved from ABA to a different modality, but this ABA therapist who was a dynamite person, and she's the one who basically whispered in her ear saying, don't say anything in front of your child that you wouldn't want them. Just assume, like, so she
intuitively knew. Appreciate it. Or understand it.
Because we're like, yeah, because I remember early on, and I'm now seeing a lot of parents who will talk about their child in a way, and their child's right next to them. They're just assuming that they're not taking it in. And it's just, I'm so appreciative of that guidance, because yes, without a doubt, they do. They're absorbing it all energetically, cognitively, whatever the case may be. And as you said, this is just a way of operating. Forget about just for your child. Stephen Covey, I'm older, so I remember reading 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And, one of the key principles he talks about in that book is the key to the 99 is the 1. It's like the key to like how you are. It's not how you treat 99% of the people. It's how you treat that 1%. Like, so bad mouthing or talking about someone in a negative way, when you do that, about one person, the other 99 are going to see how you are, and that reveals your true colors. So again, if a parent's goal is connection with their child, well, why are you talking smack about them and down and belittling them in front of, or talking about what you think their limitations are in front of them? So you can, as a parent, there's no one more important than you. For you to be looking at yourself as a source of light and inspiration for your child, if you're looking at it through that lens, you'll say the right thing, and you won't say things about your child, while they're listening that just assume they hear it all, and then that will change how what you're communicating.
And I think that should apply to all parenting, all grandparenting. I've got a bunch of grandkids, and you need to treat them with the expectation, if not even the challenge, of, even if you don't understand what I'm saying, hey, let's try to help you understand what I'm saying, and put the context there, and because the brain is amazing, and if we can just continue to feed it in a positive way, because I tell my patients this all the time, the body and the brain are learning systems, and they're going to learn whatever comes, so if you're not doing too well with the nutrition and just basic posture, or with the mind, it's still going to learn whatever you're giving it, a little or a lot, good or bad. It's a great learning system, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned grandparents and the like, what grandparents might say, particularly to a child, like their grandchild, it's funny because a lot of times I know I was bewildered by what came out of, my wife's parents, my parents, and we see it all the time with clients. And what I found helpful is it all comes down to these beliefs, because the grandparents have beliefs that they hold, and that, that is how they operate. And they're not acting with bad intent. It's just, this is how I always liken it to a playbook. Our grandparents had a playbook of how to operate in this world. They then taught the parents that, and then we take that playbook, and it's not physical, it's kind of an unwritten playbook, but it's a really crappy playbook now for all kids, because things have changed so much, but especially a child with autism. If you're trying to use that playbook of how you were raised and what your grandparents think is right or wrong, you are screwed, because you're going to only produce friction, and your child, who's already probably doing so much to keep it all together, is going to feel even less safe and more isolated. And that's where my wife and I just know that with intent, you can create a very different environment, that it's a 2-for-1. It helps you get more of what you want in terms of a journey. It helps you get more of a likelihood that the wants you have will happen. And you're presenting your child with an environment that just feels physically and emotionally safer. And so that's where it's worth the inconvenience, whatever inconvenience there is, to stack the deck for success.
That's awesome. Those are great keys. So how does one follow up? I hope people, have the opportunity to say, hey, how do I connect with you guys and the online coaching? What are the ways to connect with you?
Great. Well, actually, the simplest way is just autismparenting-secrets.com. So our podcast is Autism Parenting Secrets on all major platforms. The website, they can go there. So I highly encourage this knowledge, these insights. It's all in our podcast, and for parents, and we always try to make sure each episode ends with practical ways you can put it into action, because we're overwhelmed as parents, right? We keep hearing all kind of things, but to actually then have practical ways to put into action is the key. And that's how we've structured the episodes: one key insight, or what we call a secret, and then ways to put it into effect. But aside from that, and there's also on there, we just launched a quiz that kind of says, okay, what's your biggest autism parenting blind spot? Because there's 5 aspects of how a parent navigates the belief one I talked about. That's one. But to know which one is maybe the biggest drag on how you're operating right now, we created this quiz for parents to get that kind of insight. And we do coaching for parents who want help with implementation, and that's on the website as well. One-on-one type coaching, and we're about to launch a more of a go at your own pace course pretty soon, but that's where they can go to find out more about us.
Great. I thank you so much for joining us today, Len, and I really appreciate what you're doing and the journey that you've taken. There's nothing better than the life experience that you've been able to develop. And it hasn't been easy, I'm sure, so many bumps in the roads, but you will make it easier for others to take that journey. The first person that climbed Mount Everest, had to tell people what the road was ahead, and that's made it easier for people as they follow. So thank you for you and your wife and what you're doing. And thank you for joining me here today.
Totally my pleasure. And thank you for what you're doing. I think we're like-minded in terms of the messaging that we're wanting to put out there. And I really appreciate the work you're doing as well.
Awesome. All right, everybody. I hope you have a great day. And I know you've been blessed by this time. So we'll see you next time.